Right, now, before the event to the University of Warwick Conservative Association this evening, we're joined by Kevin Foster, the MP for Torbay. Kevin, how are you?
Fine, thanks, and it's great to be back at Warwick. I'm literally sitting in a room that I once had lectures on the law. Now I'm at Westminster helping make the law. So it's been quite a journey since, 97 was when I started here, and 2001 was then when I finally graduated.
And we were speaking earlier, you were a former president of the association. Were you kind of determined to be an MP back then, or...?
Well, I was interested. It was something I'd thought about, but it was probably about 10 years ago, about 6 years after I left Warwick, that I really seriously started to pursue it. Got on the candidates list. Stood in Coventry South in 2010, partly covering the university, came in and did some debates. Didn't quite go so well, but wasn't that far off getting elected. And then in 2013, I moved back down to Devon, where I'd grown up. And then in 2015, I became the MP for Torbay.
So obviously you were involved in the association here when you were at Warwick. Did you kind of find your political beliefs at university, or was it something that were your parents conservative? Was the area you grew up in conservative? Where do you think you kind of fell into that category?
Well, the area I grew up in was solidly conservative. Even in 1997, it had an 8,000 conservative majority, which at that time was almost unprecedented. But I think it was more, as I was growing up, neither of my family were involved in politics. It was actually me who got my dad involved rather than the other way round. And I think some of it was seeing changes going on. And some people say, of course, in the 80s that very much defined them into left-wing politics. For me, it was more the late Thatcher major years where the thing of buying your own home, doing well, being able to keep more of the fruits of your own labour, and also my family had a background of not so much being in the military, but my father worked in Devonport dockyards, so traditionally we hadn't really seen Labour as standing up for those sorts of policies. But my best friend at school in Plymouth has been a Labour activist for 20 years, and he's still an activist for the Labour Party, but in Newcastle upon Tyne now.
Oh, fantastic. Moving back to the kind of university generally, away from the Conservative Association, what were you like at uni? Were you someone who would go to all your lectures? Were you quite punctual with your work, or did you have a good time at university as well?
I'd say it's probably a bit of a balance. Yes, I did get to most of my lectures. I remember my unsurprisingly unsuccessful campaign as the Conservative Canterbury Student Union president. There was a proposal around having lectures like 8:30 in the morning, and we said, I don't think I'd quite make many of those. But although I'm getting at 7 o'clock to the House of Commons now, so I probably would have had to. But it was a balance. I enjoyed my time here. I enjoyed making new friends. Some of my views did change. I think one thing I can think of, and perhaps a journey that a lot of politics has been on and relevant with Australia, is I traditionally on things like LGBT issues had thought, just because I hadn't really met anyone, I hadn't really understood the issues. And it was the then president of Warwick Pride who said to me, Kevin, I should be a conservative because I believe in freedom of choice. Now, the Conservative Party believes in freedom of choice, except for who I love. And I thought that's a very profound point. Why do we bother ourselves? Why is this any interest of the government or the state? What type of relationship you choose as an adult to have? Now, people don't choose, are born as they are. But for me, that was actually, I thought, if that's how someone feels, if that's someone's identity, that's who they feel they are, why is it any business of mine or the law to specify otherwise? And that was at the time when there was the controversial Section 28, which is now thankfully history, was being discussed at that time. That's perhaps one of the things that certainly think I can think about that changed whilst I was at university.
And lastly, on the university, where did you live out of interest? Were you on campus? Were you in Leamington or Coventry? Or
well, I was 4 years because I also did I did a master's. So first year on campus over in Jack Martin, then second year over in Leamington, and Linton just on the edge there, with sharing house with 6 other Warwick students. Then third year was back on campus, just over the road, in the bit that falls under Warwickshire, and then fourth year I lived in central Coventry.
So moving on to your kind of parliamentary endeavours, you mentioned that you stood in Coventry South against Jim Cunningham. Also, obviously in 2015 you were successful in standing in Torbay against the incumbent Lib Dem, who'd been there for quite a while. I think he won by 12 votes or something like that when he was first elected. Did you expect to win the seat, or what kind of made you want to stand in that particular seat of Torbay?
Well, I think if we go to why I wanted to stand there, it was actually, before I came to university, I've been a Torbay YC.
Right.
So I had got family around there. I spent lots of time in Torbay as a kid and around South Devon, so I knew the area fairly well. And some of the challenges that are there around regeneration, around diversifying the economy, and also creating more opportunities for those between 18 and 50, because there's a real issue in Devon where people grow up, get to 18, look round, and a bit like I did, they have to come away for things like university and other areas. So that was very much why I felt I had a thing to offer and I could do it. Secondly, did we think it was a seat we were going to win? We knew it would be a challenge. To be fair to my predecessor, Adrian Sanders, I
think he's a councillor there now as well, so he's still. I think he might be still quite active in the area.
He's a councillor there now, although he's made very clear that he's retired in terms of parliamentary politics. I do think it's a shame that Nick Clegg didn't take the chance to put him in the Lords in 2015. I think Adrian would have done a more distinguished job than perhaps one or two who ended up there. But for me, it was, again, quite a successful campaign. We certainly got a feel come late 2014 that things were moving in our direction, and we won it by 3,000 in 2015. But I have to say, I never expected less than 2 years later, or just over 2 years later, to be getting a majority of 14,000, which is almost unprecedented. The last time there was a 5-figure majority in Torbay was on very different boundaries back in the 1970s. So it has seen a huge shift in the last few years.
Yeah, obviously in that, your kind of majority in 2017 was remarkable, and a lot of your colleagues obviously did lose their seat, and I'm sure obviously you were very sad to hear that on election night, but do you think you did anything differently that they could have done, or I mean, why do you think you increased your majority so much and so many of your colleagues maybe lost their seats?
I think there were a couple of local factors, including the fact that my predecessor, who had a good reputation, didn't stand again, and they had a new candidate who spent a lot of the election campaign attacking me, and I spent a lot of the election campaign thinking, great, because I knew it wasn't going down very well on the doorsteps. But in that, there was also perhaps a message then about the National Conservative campaign. We spent far too long attacking Jeremy Corbyn, far too long running people down on social media and not actually putting forward anything, the real positive policies that we could have been putting forward, and add on well-known blunders around fox hunting and perhaps social care as well, which did not connect at all with the voting. And I'm someone who's resolutely opposed to repeal of the fox hunting ban. Right. So hearing that come out again, just thought, why? What a waste of time all round that will be in that debate, because we know what the outcome's going to be. It's going to fail. That it's not going to be repealed. I think there's messages to be taken. I think particularly around housing, and also what message of aspiration we put out, because particularly now being PPS the housing minister, if people under 40 are giving up on being able to own their own home, then they're going to quickly start giving up on voting Conservative. And likewise, that people want to know that we understand that you don't. It's not just about what you come out from university with; it's what life's going to be. And part of that is not an unreasonable aspiration of owning a reasonable home, and that's something we need to deal with. Because when I was here, housing was still relatively affordable, and those who could luckily buy at the end of university got a reasonable home. Those coming out now are facing house prices that are many times their income, meaning that it's probably going to be some time. The thing I say is, myself and my dad both bought a house at the average age for a first-time buyer. The thing was, he did it at 25 in the 1970s, and I did it at 36 2 years ago.
Very different circumstances. Final few things. I just wanted to ask you, obviously, since you've been an MP, it's been quite an eventful time in politics. We've seen Brexit. You, of course, supported Remain. I mean, how do you kind of assess, obviously, there's a lot of talk this week about the Telegraph front page where they kind of put pictures of Remainer Conservatives on there, or Ramonas, as I'm sure some Brexiteers refer to them. What do you think of kind of the state of our politics and how the media are covering our politicians? Do you think it's quite toxic?
Yeah, I have to say, I didn't think the Daily Telegraph front page was at all constructive or helpful. If people have got genuine concerns they wish to express, then that's what Parliament's there for. It's why we elect as individual constituencies, not as party lists, where you just sort of list the 100 people who support the party leader and that's about it. So for me, I didn't think that was helpful. And we are having a debate in Parliament. We're going through a process, as bluntly we did the other way around back in the 1970s when there was plenty of dissent on both government and opposition benches around the 1972 European Communities Act. So the coverage can be unhelpful, and I think also we always have to take some things with a pinch of salt. One thing I don't do is rush to comment every time there's a story about another politician in the paper, because I find too often what was a screaming headline one month is a very quiet retraction the next, particularly about personal individuals. And the issues we've had recently at Westminster, yes, there's serious issues that need to be dealt with around harassment and potential abuse, and they should be dealt with rightly. But a list that was being circulated, when you went through it, a lot of it was just consensual relationships that was more seemed there purely for titillation rather than any issue of abuse or abuse of power. And that for me is where sometimes we have to look behind the headlines and see what facts are actually there.
Brilliant. And final thing, obviously you're a Warwick alumnus and you're very successful. You've become a Member of Parliament. I'm sure on all sides of the political spectrum there are Warwick students who would love to be a Member of Parliament in Westminster. What kind of advice, obviously there's no kind of direct route to becoming an MP, but what advice would you give people?
I think the simple thing is be determined about it. If you give up the first time something goes wrong, or the first time you don't get selected, or the first time you don't get elected, you know what, you'll never get anywhere with it. And that's the key, is determination. I can think of people similarly here 20 years ago who were going to go on to be MPs, but they just gave up at the first hurdle when first time something went wrong. That's a key message for me, would be determined about it, work hard and be focused, and also think of what you're doing now that might reflect in years to come. The one advantage that I had is I wasn't in an era of social media, whereas now, of course, a lot of people putting stuff on Facebook that can easily be quoted, but my key message is if it's something you want to do and that's your dream, that's your goal, work towards it and don't give up the first time something goes wrong, because very few of us got there the first time.
Kevin Foster, thank you very much for joining me.
My name's Kevin Foster and you're listening to Raw.